Welcome back. So let's get to work on the deck of cards exercise. The first goal for this video will be to send a request at the beginning after a component has mounted to grab a deck ID. We'll store that in the state so that in the next video we can start making requests for individual cards. So I have a new empty app. You can see our lovely React logo. And I'm going to make a couple of components, really just two, a deck component and a card component. We could get away without a card component. It's going to be stateless. It just displays information about, or it's just an image and then alt text. However, we're also going to style it at the end where we're picking random numbers for the rotation, the translation, the transformation to make it look like a real card that's sort of in a stack. So because of that, it makes a lot more sense to make it its own component. Not to mention the fact that if you wanted to add any functionality to make a game or do anything with these cards, it would definitely need to be its own component. But we're just beginning with the deck component, and I'm going to begin with an H1 inside of there that says, I don't know, card dealer. And then we're going to need to add our constructor. We're going to have a couple things in the state, but for now, I'm just going to add in a place to store the deck ID. And rather than just storing the deck ID, I'm going to store the entire response. So this dot state equals, and we'll have something called deck, which is just initialized to, let's just do null. So deck eventually will be my response from my very first request, and it will contain the ID. And then later, once we're actually getting cards, we'll make an array called drawn, or I don't know, drawn cards, and that will be an empty array. But for now, I'm just going to leave it as deck. Next, we need to write the code to go and fetch that deck ID. So let's get the URL that we need to request, which is right here, deckofcardsapi.com/api/deck/shuffle/new/shuffle. And where should we store this? Well, we could put it in the state, but that's not a good idea because this is never changing. We could make it a prop, a default prop, but that doesn't make much sense either because this isn't really a property that is going to impact the component. We're not going to allow someone to pass in a new API URL. It's never going to change. So instead of making it part of the state or a prop, I'm going to just make this a constant and call it API URL equals this string. Now I'll have access to this inside my component, but it doesn't actually have to be part of state or props. Now, where do we make the request? We do it inside of component did mount. So after the constructor runs after the first render, then this will be called, as we talked about in the lifecycle methods section. And then we're going to actually make the request, and I'm going to use Axios again, except I don't have Axios. So I'm going to go install it. npm install Axios. I'll fast forward. All right, and then I'll start my server back. Okay, so I'm going to import Axios, as we've seen before. Import Axios from Axios, and I don't know why I put quotes there. We're not trying to import a string. There we go. Now inside of here, component did mount, we're going to do an axios.get, and then pass in our URL, which is API URL. But rather than chaining on our .then, I'm going to make this an async function. We had a video on this, if you didn't watch it, back in the lifecycle methods section. So async component did mount. I'm going to make a variable called deck equals axios.get, and we're going to await axios.get that URL. And then afterwards, whatever code I write that comes next, we'll wait for this to finish. So I don't have to do any like callback functions, nested stuff. It's nice and flat. I'm going to set state, and I'm going to take this deck response. That deck includes information about the response itself, so it's not just the data. All that we want is to set our state deck right here to be deck.data. The data is the payload, it's the information coming back from the API. If we just did deck, it would include a bunch of additional stuff, like the status code, the headers, a bunch of things we don't care about. So if I just do this, and I now make sure I'm including my deck component, so import deck, from ./deck, and then come down here, delete almost everything, and render a single deck component. Fingers crossed that it will work. Let's look in our React Dev Tools, go into our deck and look at the state. So we have deck, and it has a deck ID. It has remaining set to 52. It has success of true, and shuffled is true as well. and that's because the URL that we requested included /shuffle. So you can also get an unshuffled deck, but then our app would be displaying the same thing, the same order every time. Okay, so all we really need is the deck ID, but I'm going to keep the whole deck there because we might want to use remaining later on to calculate how many cards are left. All right, so I'll end the video here. We made our deck component and we successfully fetched some information about a new deck. We have that ID. So in the next video, we can add a button here to start making new requests to get new cards.